So we'll start by just taking a moment to fully arrive. So I encourage you to gently close the eyes and come into a comfortable seated position. It doesn't need to be a specific meditation posture, just however you feel comfortable seated today. The spine is straight. The head and the neck are in line with the spine. We can gently roll the shoulders back, opening the chest. We can take an inhalation through the nose and exhale out through the mouth. Deep inhalation. Exhaling through the mouth. We bring our awareness to the heart center, in the middle of the chest, slightly to the right. Feeling into the space of the heart. A sense of intimacy. A feeling of expansion. The feeling of coming back home. Resting in the heart. And gently, when we're ready, we can slowly open the eyes. So namaste again, everyone, and welcome. So today's sharing is the first of 3 sharings that we'll be exploring this month on the topic of death. So the talk tonight will be followed by a sharing from Jimena next week, and then with a sharing from Stephanie a week later. And each of us will be giving kind of a unique short sharing, just really based on whatever we feel really inspired to share on. So even though we'll be covering the same topic, it will be unique and it will be slightly different each week. So if it's something that you enjoy tonight, then I do really encourage you to have a look at the other events for this month. Yeah, so thinking about the topic of death and preparing for this talk, I really felt quite a range of emotions, which was interesting because that's not kind of the reaction I often get when I'm preparing to share. It was quite unique, and it was very particular because I was talking about death. And on the one hand, I felt this kind of, well, it was kind of hard to label, but it was certainly a sense of uneasiness and a little bit of a contraction. And I think in the West, there is quite a lot of dis-ease surrounded with death, the process of dying. Even I've really kind of become to notice, as I've been preparing for this talk, even in particular, the sort of uneasiness that's even in terms of discussing death or contemplating it, they can be seen as really morbid or just depressing activities, which is interesting because death is obviously the only single guarantee that any one of us has in this lifetime, and death is this unifying factor that we all share. It's an experience that each and every one of us will go through. And it's kind of interesting, some of the common secular vernacular in the West, and I guess kind of our general attitude to death is very much of a sense of death being final. You kind of describe death sometimes as, oh, he's dead as a dodo, and obviously dodos were these birds that have now become extinct. So it's very much attached with this kind of sense of finality. Or the expression even like another one bites the dust, if anyone's familiar with that. It can be used in two ways. It can be used to refer to the fact that someone's passed away, or it can also be used to describe a failure. And I just thought that was kind of interesting, that even hidden in our language, there is a sense of death being, a bit of a failure or very much a final ending of this life. And there also does seem to be a huge amount, very naturally, of fear around death. And there is certainly, at least from what I've seen and what I understand, I'm not a doctor myself, but there does seem to be a strong emphasis in Western medicine of prolonging life, a real focus of making sure that patients can stay alive for as long as possible. And there was this really interesting book that was recommended by a friend, by Atul Gawande. It's called Being Mortal, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. And it's really fascinating. The author is a Boston surgeon and also a professor at Harvard University. And he was really writing from his experience of having worked as a surgeon for many, 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 many years. And feeling kind of jaded in terms of what is happening in the West in terms of our treatment of patients. And he describes in the foreword of the book the following. He says, "Mortality can be a treacherous subject. Some will be alarmed by the prospect of a doctor's writings about the inevitability of decline and death. For many, such talk, however carefully framed, raises the spectre of society readying itself to sacrifice its sick and aged. But what if the sick and aged are already being sacrificed, victims of our refusal to accept the inexorability of our life cycle? And what if there are better approaches right in front of our eyes waiting to be recognized. And I found those words to be really powerful, especially as a person with his particular experience of being a medical doctor in the West, and yet still seeing that perhaps the Western approach to death and dying isn't the best way. And perhaps there are things that we could do to change this, and perhaps they are there right in front of our eyes. And that kind of hits exactly on the other feeling that I felt simultaneously to feeling this kind of sense of unease and a little contraction about talking about death. Was I felt really inspired to share just tonight just a few of the teachings and the wisdom that I've really kind of had the privilege to receive on the spiritual path. And the reason why I feel that these are so special is because they don't require us to have access to money or resources or technology, but rather it's just a kind of a shift in perspective. And the more we go deeper into this path, particularly when we start really practicing spiritual practices, and it's not just this perspective being gained on an intellectual level, but really being understood through direct knowledge, then really we can start to foster a whole new relationship with death and dying, not only of our own deaths, but the deaths of loved ones and friends. I know for many of us, we're probably a lot more afraid of losing our loved ones than we may even be of our own deaths. So tonight we'll just be exploring kind of generally how different spiritual traditions approach death and how they look upon death. And then we'll turn to see how we can start opening to death ourselves and how we can start preparing for death without necessarily being prompted by a near-death experience or losing a loved one or a friend to start this exploration, but how we can start doing that now. So I first just wanted to look at kind of the importance of death, generally speaking, in spiritual traditions. There is definitely a very strong emphasis of death. It's seen as very important. I would say really, to my knowledge, in every spiritual tradition that I've come across, but particularly in the Oriental traditions, there is a really strong emphasis about the special role of death. And the Buddha, even in the Buddha's very earliest teachings, his foundational teachings when he first started to lecture in India, he started talking about death very early on. And the Buddha said that we can use our lives to prepare for death. And this is interesting because already we can kind of see like this huge shift in terms of perspective. So instead of death being seen as the end of life, as this final end, this cut off of living, it's really kind of been turned on its head, and the Buddha is saying that life is preparing us for the journey of death. And there's a really strong emphasis of death and the process of dying, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism. So many of us will have heard of the Bardo Thodol, which is also known in English as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I have a little copy here. Obviously, it comes in all different sorts of shapes and sizes. But it's described here, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation through understanding the in-between. And really, it's quite like a comprehensive guide. It kind of describes very scientifically almost, from so many years of wisdom and direct experience of the processes and the experiences and the stages which one will go through when we die. And in particular, it talks about these time periods not time periods, but more like stages or phases called bardos, where we kind of have different experiences as we start transitioning out of this body and into the unknown. And the Dalai Lama, he gives a really kind of clear quote just describing what this book does and how it guides us in death. He says, "The process of dying begins with dissolution of the elements within the body. It has 8 stages, beginning with the dissolution of the earth element, then the water, fire, and wind elements. The color, appearance of a white vision, an increase of the red element, black, near attainment, and finally, the clear light of death." So it's obviously an incredibly comprehensive guide, and the Dalai Lama is kind of just summarizing here some of the different signs or stages that the book kind of explores in a huge amount of detail. And to put it really plainly, the book is giving guidance to spiritual practitioners as they come to die on the things that they should look out for and the things that they should maybe do in order to prepare themselves for the journey, and as they're on this journey, so they can try and have kind of the most auspicious rebirth as possible, or if possible, ideally to not be reborn at all and to completely dissolve into life itself, or just to dissolve in this white light, this clear light. I wanted to share some words from Frank Ostaseski. He's an incredible Buddhist teacher, and he founded the Zen Hospice Project, which some of you might be familiar with. He founded it many years ago with a spiritual teacher named Ram Dass, and he also founded the Metta Institute. And Frank has spent many decades sitting with over 1,000 people on the precipice of their death, providing them with support and guidance, and really just holding space for people. And from that experience of being in service to the dying, he wrote this book called The 5 Invitations. And they're kind of lessons that he's just gleaned from his experience of serving the dying. And in it, he describes death. He says, "Death is not waiting for us at the end of a long road. Death is always with us, in the marrow of every passing moment. A secret teacher hiding in plain sight, helping us to discover what matters most in life." And I thought Frank's words were really beautiful, and they really kind of hone in to what so many of these spiritual traditions are sharing. That death isn't just something that happens to us at one stage of our lives. It actually is a secret teacher which is there in every single passing moment. And we can start opening to it as a teacher here and now. And this kind of leads me to the second point that I really wanted to share, which is that the time is now. So for those of us who have had experiences with death, maybe perhaps we've had a serious illness, or we've had a near-death experience ourselves, or maybe we've lost someone who we love. And often when we go through these experiences, well, there are actually like a lot of things that naturally come up. So very common to feel a huge amount of sorrow, grief, sadness, and depending on circumstances, a whole kind of raft of other emotions, guilt. A lot of things can come up. But it's also interesting because simultaneously, even despite kind of the heaviness of those emotions, or how potent those feelings and emotions can be, there can also be a sense of profound freedom. For example, I have had a few friends pass away, and I have lost people who are really, really, really dear to me. And I just remember so distinctly that in the midst of the intensity, there was such a freedom, because all of the little things that used to really bother me and that used to plague my thoughts, or kind of give me a lot of grief, things that I seemed to really care about, just absolutely disappeared in those moments. And it brought on such a huge shift in perspective. And that was a really liberating experience. So death can, in this way, obviously, prompt kind of a closer examination of life, this sense of maybe a deeper connectedness, or really just feeling into the richness of life as it already presents. But wisdom shares that we don't need to wait for death to come to us. And in fact, the teachings are really clear that we shouldn't do that, that actually we want to prepare ourselves for death. And Padmasambhava, he's a very famous and revered master from the 8th century. And he's understood to have brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet. So he's kind of like the founder of Tibetan Buddhism. And he writes quite plainly and frankly, "Those who believe they have plenty of time get ready only at the time of death. Then they are ravaged by regret. But isn't it far too late?" So he's saying here in pretty clear words that those of us who wait to get ready only at the time of death are going to find it probably pretty difficult. And at that stage, it's far too late. And we can see the same sort of rhetoric being shared by Montaigne, who was a very significant philosopher of the French Renaissance. And for those of you who came to this event through the Facebook, event, you can see this quote because we included it on there. It says, "Men come and they go, and they trot and they dance, never a word about death. All well and good. Yet when death does come to them, their wives, their children, their friends, catching them unawares and unprepared, then what storms of passion overwhelm them? What cries, what fury, what despair? We do not know where death awaits us. So let us wait for it everywhere. To practice death is to practice freedom. A man who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. Yeah, and I just thought those words are really beautiful. We do not know where death awaits us, so let us wait for it everywhere. So it kind of prompts the question, how do we open ourselves to death? The sages and the mystics are telling us that we need to start preparing for death. Before it comes, we should do it now. So what can we do? Well, actually, there are many ways in which we could do this. In every tradition, there are kind of so many different techniques. For example, this is one that my teacher likes to share often in retreats. Sahajananda often quotes this. He refers to the hermits of St. Paul of France. And it said that these hermits would greet each other instead of saying the traditional hello or good morning or a little chit chat about the weather. They greet each other with memento mori, which means remember that you die. So this is a bit of a savage salutation in a way, greeting each other with such a kind of strong rhetoric. But for them, embracing death and this kind of constant contemplation of death was held in such a high regard that they embodied it as their salutation, and it wasn't seen as depressing. It was seen as a very friendly reminder to your brother or to your sister that death awaits us. And another kind of extreme example, but I wanted to share it because it's incredibly fascinating. Many of us may have heard of the Agori monks, who very famously live in Varanasi in India. They're often recognizable because they cover the entire body with ash from cremation grounds. If anyone's ever travelled to Varanasi, you'll know there's cremations happening all along the ghats and really throughout the city, alongside the river Ganges. The Agori monks are said to meditate in cemeteries. It's also said that they drink from skulls, so they have this very intense spiritual practice, which is just completely revolving around death and dying. So again, that's quite extreme, and I'm not suggesting that any of us need to take such an extreme sort of approach, but they are kind of examples of the way in which people do start to really explore death in a really deep way. But the one that I really wanted to touch on, because I do feel that it's a path which I've connected to a lot over the past couple of years, and I do feel it's something which is really accessible to lots of people, and this is discovering who we really are. And Sogyal Rinpoche, many of you will have also heard of him. He famously wrote the Tibetan book of living and dying, and I guess we can kind of describe it in a way that he kind of distills a lot of the teachings from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is kind of very dense, and he presents it in a way which is really palatable for the Western mind. And he says really early on in this book, perhaps the deepest reason why we're afraid of death is because we do not know who we are. perhaps the deepest reason why we are afraid of death is because we do not know who we are. And he goes on to say, we believe in a personal, unique, and separate identity. But if we dare to examine it, we find that this identity depends entirely on an endless collection of things to prop it up. Our name, our biography, our partners, family, home, job, friends, credit card. It is on their fragile and transient support that we rely on for our security. So when they are all taken away, will we have any idea of who we really are? And so this kind of idea of discovering who we really are is often commonly referred to as self-inquiry. And self-inquiry is really kind of a complete path in itself. And it's been around since the dawn of time. So probably since as long as human beings have been conscious, they have been contemplating who they are. The aphorism, know yourself, was inscribed on the forecourt of the Greek temple of Apollo, which is located at Delphi. Socrates, in 400 BC, is said to have said, an unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, and really you can kind of see self-inquiry in every spiritual tradition. But just kind of another example, in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad said, whoever knows himself knows his Lord. And there are lots of ways in which we can do self-inquiry, just kind of in a really broad kind of approach, or broadly speaking. Really anything which helps us to slow down, specifically to slow down the mind, that allows us to connect into the body and allows us to go deeper and deeper in terms of feeling into and having this direct experience with more and more subtle layers of this being, going deeper and deeper in this regard. Any kind of technique or practice that allows us to do this can really be considered a practice of self-inquiry. And so, for example, this would include meditation, forms of yoga, breath work even is a really amazing way of feeling different subtle energies of the body. You can even say whirling, the whirling dervishes, or whirling Sufis, they would whirl and whirl and whirl in circles in a way that would fully shut down the mind and allow them to really feel in a very direct way this background of stillness, or the deepest core of their being. So through this very dynamic movement. So there's so many ways that we can do this. And in the yogic tradition, self-inquiry is referred to as Atma Vichara. And self-inquiry is core to the teachings of the 20th century sage Ramana Maharshi. And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, I have a little picture of him right here. Hridaya meditation and Hatha yoga, which is the school where I studied for the past few years and where I did my teacher training, is really focused on the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, and have very much included his teachings in terms of self-inquiry and the way in which they do Hridaya meditation and also the Hatha yoga practice. And Ramana described this Atma Vichara, or self-inquiry, as the most sacred of the sacred. So it's a very special path. And the way that it works is and this is obviously putting it very plainly and simply, is in meditation we normally have an object of meditation. So that might be, for example, meditating on a flame, or meditating on our breath, becoming incredibly intimate with every inhalation, every exhalation. And this can be very, very good for quieting down the mind. But in self-inquiry, instead of putting the awareness and the attention on something external, say, for example, the breath or a flame, or picturing a deity, or whatever it is, we turn that attention back inwards. And more specifically, we bring the attention back to the subject. We bring the attention back to the one who is observing, back to the one who is looking. And it can be a little bit maybe difficult to describe, because what we're kind of searching for in this meditation is really best described as ineffable, meaning that there really aren't words to describe it. But the object of meditation is best described as objectless. We aren't focusing on an external object. Rather, we're really bringing all of our attention and awareness onto a sense of pure existence. So it's more like a feeling of simply being. And this feeling of just existing is completely separate from the thinking rational mind. There's no labeling, no concepts. It is really just bringing this awareness again and again back to this pure sense of beingness. And so we can think, okay, well, how does this pure sense of beingness relate to death? And how can this self-inquiry help us to create or foster a deeper relationship with death and dying? Well, it's really interesting because I guess the deeper we kind of go into this practice, and it does really take a lot of time and practice. So meditation it's certainly not something that happens overnight. We live in a very quick world where we want fast food, fast sex, fast pleasure, all of these sorts of things, and meditation is kind of the opposite of that. It's a very slow path. But slowly, the more we practice meditation in this way, for example, we start to get kind of these glimpses or these insights of more and more subtle layers of our being. And the deeper we go, we start to get these really like glimpses of not understanding it in terms of on an intellectual level, but through kind of direct experience. And we start to connect with the deepest essence of our being, which is completely beyond all of the thoughts and the labels and the concepts. And as I said already, it's an ineffable space or an ineffable dimension. So it's quite difficult to describe or to put words to it. Just could never really do it justice. But we do start to see that beyond all of the busyness, beyond all of the things that are coming and going, there is something that is always there, and it's permanent. And it is immortal. When we start to really dive deep into it, we can see that unlike everything else, unlike our thoughts, unlike this body, this background that we connect to doesn't have a start and it doesn't have an end. And so in this way, it's really deathless. It's completely immortal. And so when we start to really connect in this direct way to the core of our being, we start peeling all of the layers back and we start to develop this very intimate relationship with this core which has always been there. Then we do start to have a very different relationship with death and with dying. And I just wanted to share some words from Ramana Maharshi, who describes what it's like when we connect to this deathless realm. He says, know that the eradication of the identification of the body is charity, spiritual austerity, and ritual sacrifice. It is virtue, divine union and devotion. It is heaven, wealth, peace and truth. It is grace. It is the state of divine silence. It is the deathless death. It is jnana, which means direct knowledge, renunciation, final liberation, and bliss. So, yeah. That's kind of really what I wanted to share with you tonight. I'm conscious that I've already gone over time quite a bit. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to share as like a little introduction as to some of the jewels that death can offer us and how we can perhaps start reorientating our perceptions of death and our relationship to it through, I guess, any spiritual teaching that we resonate with is probably very likely to have some pearls of wisdom on it. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to share. If anyone has any questions, then you're more than welcome to put them into the little chat bar, and I'll be very happy to answer them. And I appreciate that there's a little bit of a delay, so just wait maybe a couple of minutes, just if anyone's got any questions. But I wanted to conclude with a really beautiful saying. I discovered this in the first ever meditation retreat that I did. It's some words by Rabindranath Tagore, and he's a 19th century Bengali poet. He's very famous, and if anyone's read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, he talks incredibly fondly. There's a whole chapter dedicated to him. But these are my favorite words on death. He says, let life be like summer flowers and death like autumn leaves. Oh, just seeing some of the comments here now. I hope the sound got a bit better. Just seeing from Stephen that it got a bit garbled. Sorry about that. I do hope it got better, and if it didn't, I apologise. But yes, I can't see any questions coming through, which is fine. So perhaps we'll leave it there. And if anyone feels inspired to kind of continue this contemplation and exploration, then I do encourage you to have a look at the events that we have in the next couple of weeks for Jimena and also for Stephanie. So I wanted to thank you all for attending and sending you all a lot of love. Wishing you a beautiful evening, night, morning, wherever you are.